Hello to everybody coming in. Great. Looks like we have a few people ready to go. Hello, everyone. I am Erica, coming at you from Green Apple Books on the Park in the Sunset District of San Francisco. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our event with Chenxing Han and Arisika Razak. We are celebrating the release of Be the Refuge by Chenxing Han. Just before we get started, I want to make a few announcements for Green Apple. This Saturday, June 12th, we are excited to have Paul Mendez joining us for a discussion of his debut novel, Rainbow Milk, along with Jeremy Atherton Lynn. And if you tune in next Monday on June 14th, we'll have Martha Cooley discussing her new novel, Buy Me Love with Anne Germanicos. And for tonight's event, please be advised, we have our chat open and a Q&A feature. The chat, you can feel free to leave friendly comments for our authors, and any questions you have about the reading and their work, you can put in the Q&A feature. It should be just at the bottom of your screens there. And around the end of the reading, we will get to your questions. And I am honored to be presenting to you Arisika Razak, an MPH professor emerita and former chair of the Women's Spirituality Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She is a core teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, California, and a graduate of Spirit Rock's DPP program. Her teachings incorporate diverse spiritual traditions, multicultural feminisms, and contemporary diversity theory. For over 20 years, Arisika served as an inner city midwife, providing birthing care to women from over 70 countries. She has facilitated spiritual healing and empowerment workshops for over 30 years and performed nationally and internationally as a spiritual dancer. Her film credits include Fire Eyes, the first full-length feature film by an African woman on female genital cutting, and Who Lives, Who Dies on healthcare for the indigent. Arisika presents at numerous conferences on the subjects of womanism, diversity, women's health and healing, and embodied spiritual traditions. She is also a regular contributor to books and journals, most recently Afrikan Wisdom, New Voices Talk Black Liberation, Buddhism, and Beyond, which will be released on July 20th by North Atlantic Books. And Chenxing Han is a Bay Area-based writer whose publications have appeared in Buddha Dharma, Journal of Global Buddhism, Lion's Roar, Pacific World, Tricycle, and elsewhere. Born in Shanghai and raised in Pennsylvania and Washington State, she holds a BA from Stanford University, an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union, and a certificate in Buddhist chaplaincy from the Institute of Buddhist Studies. Be the Refuge is her first book. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Arisika. Enjoy the show, everyone.
So I want to welcome everyone. And just because we're both talking about spiritual traditions, I'd just like to ask you, the audience, wherever you are, just notice your feet on the floor, if you're sitting, your sits bones on the chair, your body if it's lying down, because for some of us, that's what we need to do. And I invite you to just put one hand over the belly and one over the heart. And we'll just take a couple of breaths together. Thank you so much. Thank you for helping us get settled. Chenxing, did you want to have me start? Did you want to ask me to read something? Was that our plan?
Sure, I think so. Thank you so much, Arisika. How lovely to arrive in this very embodied way. I know that's so much of the part of the work that you do. And I just want to also thank Green Apple Books, thank Erica, and also Carr for helping put this event together. And just thank everyone who's joining us here for this hour as well. I know originally I was supposed to be in conversation with Brisha Wade, who's the author of Grieving While Black, but I'm so excited and so grateful to you, Arisika, for stepping in rather last minute to be in conversation, and also very excited for Afrikan Wisdom, this forthcoming book that I wish I had a copy of, but of course it's not in print yet. And so I loved your chapter there and some of the other articles that you've written. And I was wondering if perhaps for the audience, you could read just a short passage from your contribution to that collection, Afrikan Wisdom, just to share a little sneak peek with us.
I began this essay by saying, I am a 71-year-old US-born African-American woman whose African ancestry is uncertain. However, I take great pride in my African diasporic foremothers who were priestesses, healers, agriculturalists, warriors, mothers, leaders, teachers, midwives, and artists. Their traditions survived, and I salute and honor them. While Africa is a continent and not a country, many African diasporic scholars have acknowledged commonalities found in African traditional religions. Although not every African religion includes all the following, some of these commonalities include: 1, belief in a sentient, ensouled universe containing sacred ancestors, elemental powers, and other than human entities who influence human life and well-being. Diverse pantheons of male, female, non-gendered, and or ambiguously gendered deities, and deities who change genders. Inclusive community-based rituals with drummers, dancers, praise singers, and musicians. Highly trained priesthoods inclusive of women. Embodied worship styles enabling trance, spirit possession, healing and prophesying, and a rich tradition of sacred kings and queens. And I just wanted to start there because the book is titled Afrikan Wisdom, and it's new voices speaking Black liberation, Buddhism, and beyond. And the piece I wrote is really about the role of women in African diasporic communities. It's general, so not everywhere in all times and all places, but these are the broad strokes. And Chenxing, I wanted to ask if you would read from the beginning of Be the Refuge, you know, and talk about what inspired you maybe to write your book.
Absolutely. And, you know, when I read this, even that list that you provided, I was just so struck by it because you are speaking of African religions broadly, but I thought of how there are so many resonances in this list with Buddhism. And I was thinking about how kind of ancestors is a theme in our work. And reading from the beginning of the book is fun because I think it actually really brings in ancestors and ritual and some of the themes that you're lifting in your piece. So I'll just begin here with the introduction. Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor. 100 times we invoke the Buddha of infinite light, the melody a slow river as row by row we stand, approaching the center aisle in twinned tributaries, arriving at the altar in pairs. Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor. From my prayer-pressed hands, a long-stemmed carnation sprouts, stretching to the ceiling as if yearning to break free to the sun-drenched sky beyond. Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor. Bending our waists and lowering our hearts, we bow in front of the enlightened ones, a patient stream of mourners dipping in reverence beneath the compassionate gaze of the Buddhas. Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor, Ami Tuofor. We release our flowers. My carnation nestles atop a dozen others in peaceful repose, green-tipped feet and marigold bloom head reaching to opposite ends of the rotunda wall. Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo. Louder and faster the chanting swells. Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo. A warm sea of voices. Ami Tuofo, Ami Tuofo. A sweet familiar melody. Ami Tuofo, choking bitterly in my throat. Ami Tuofo. Silence, save for a few hushed sobs. I blink open eyes, sticky with tears. A mountain of flowers rises in parinirvana. In the portrait on the altar, Aaron is beaming. It's as if he's saying to all of us, as he once wrote to me, whenever you may feel your energy flagging, know that somewhere I am quietly yet furiously cheering you on with a big smile. Looking around the overflowing memorial pavilion, it dawns on me that I have never chanted with so many other young adult Asian Americans before. Grief and gratitude unite us on this bright October day in Southern California. I see I'm not the only one smiling through my tears.
Oh, that is so beautiful. And it carries the essence of the ceremony so beautifully. You know, I really do want to acknowledge some of the similarities that we're talking about. And I don't know if you probably are familiar with but that altars to the dead, they're in our temples, they're in our spiritual houses, but they're also in the street. That, you know, there's a tradition, I think, when gang members die, there's a tradition when, as I've traveled sometimes in Mexico, that shrines by the side of the road. And certainly in that most recent round of Black Lives Matter, there were so many beautiful altars and art installations. And so I think one of the things I just want to acknowledge, that whether we're talking about Black people and the diversity of our spiritualities or the diversity of Buddhism, that love for the ancestors, reverence for the ancestors, reverence for the elders is really a deep, deep part of spiritual practice. I think it's been less so, my experience in convert Buddhist establishments, it was less so. But as we talk about these root cultures, I'm glad to see these parallels.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned it, being brought into the street. I think also after the Atlanta area shootings, I mean, the outpouring of, you could see it as all of these different people coming together as well. So the ways that we do have these altars, they're not just only in our private homes, the kind of communal need to express ourselves creatively. And I suppose I should answer your question too, of sort of the inspiration for the book. And certainly, I think a big part of the inspiration there are, I think every book has a multi-stranded origin story, but one very important part of the origin story was my friend Aaron, whose funeral I'm opening with here. And he was someone who blogged as the Angry Asian Buddhist, someone who was, a pioneering voice in having us talk about issues of race and representation in American Buddhism for the Asian American Buddhist community in particular. And of course, we know that actually Black Buddhists and of course Asian American Buddhists have actually long been writing about this issue, but it seems that especially for a more mainstream, predominantly, white convert dominated media, that these issues are only really starting to, they've really risen to the fore, certainly in this past couple years. But I think a lot about how this book might not have come into being. We were talking earlier today about how, unfortunately, academic sometimes means like a very dry and unreadable book. And I would say the first version I had of this book was actually rather academic and dry. There were like 500 footnotes or something. And then when Aaron passed away so suddenly of cancer in 2017, and he was just 34, the age I am now, it just, it shook me so deeply. And I realized I need a book that is for him, for Aaron, and for his friends. Because if he had anger, it was rooted in a deep love for his communities. It was the kind of like, wrathful anger that wakes us up and shakes us a little bit when we need to be, so we're not just staying in a stupor. And I thought, how could I write a book that would speak to him and that would come from a similar place, really of love, but that wasn't going to sugarcoat that love, and that was going to have to talk about some of the difficult truths, because that's part of the experience of more broadly speaking, people of color Buddhists, the experiences of tensions and microaggressions and even macroaggressions and violence, even unfortunately in our Buddhist communities and our sanghas at times.
I think it's really real, this kind of marginalization. I had read some of his blogs or some of his statements, and because there's a trope of the quote angry Black woman, and it doesn't matter whether it's Michelle Obama or whoever it is, there's this desire to see us always that when we're passionate, we're angry. It's like, and I loved him taking that moniker, just confronting it head on. And one of the things I do know because of my work in health, there are actually studies that show that when somebody did studies a long time ago, over 20 years ago, and basically they showed African Americans images of racist incidents, and the people who yelled and screamed, they had lower blood pressures than those of us who have worked so long in predominantly white institutes, learned how to take a breath, hold things in, deal and not deal. But the people who got angry. So I think that even in Buddhist communities, we don't always understand the power of righteous anger, not the anger that wants to dominate or take over, but the anger that arises when we see injustice, when we see a child or an animal, the anger that arises at how the earth is being plundered, how our habitat is being, defiled. And so we may all be in training to be enlightened, but I haven't met an enlightened person yet. So I think that while we're human, if we can look at our anger, not identify with it, see it arise as a calling to action, I think that's a very powerful thing to do. And Aaron certainly did that. He called attention to so much injustice.
Absolutely. I love what you say about, vocalizing, because there are so many ways to vocalize and it's not harmful at all, right? It's actually quite the opposite. It's healing, exactly as you said. We were also talking earlier today. I loved what you said about collective mourning, lament, grief, which also I think means keening and wailing. And, there's also chant in the Buddhist tradition and so much else that is such an important part. I know that for many Asian American Buddhists, including ones I've interviewed, it can be kind of strange to see Buddhism defined as just being silent only or only sitting there in silence. And we're wondering, wait, where's the food? Where's the part where we talk to each other, where we laugh, where we sing together, right? Like that's a very important part of building community, of building spiritual friendship.
I want to say that because I started out because friends invited me into a small sangha in the Western meditation-based convert Buddhist tradition. I really didn't know very much about other traditions. And then, friends of mine, there's a Nichiren, there's Buddhism that follows the traditions of Nichiren, who chanted the title of the Lotus Sutra. So some people have heard Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. It's the chant that Tina Turner turned to. That was her introduction to Buddhism. One of the splinter groups of that tradition conducted a year-long pilgrimage to heal the wounds of the Middle Passage. They're a group that has gone to Auschwitz, they've gone to Cambodia, they've gone to sites of great, great harm and prayed and chanted and meditated. And they took a year-long pilgrimage to sites where African people had come off of the slave ship. They went to plantations, they heard oral stories, they walked down the west coast of Africa, they went to Jamaica and Puerto Rico and Cuba. They went to all the major sites and they chanted and they prayed. And this is a very embodied book. The other thing, when I was writing one of my articles, I found that the local Ohlone, you and I are both in, I think, Ohlone territory.
Yes.
We're in Ramakush and I'm Chichenyo speaking Ohlone territory. They went on a pilgrimage with the Ohlone to go through all their shell mounds in the state of California. It wasn't a straight pilgrimage. It occurred over 3 years, and I think it was a certain designated period of time. So there are groups that peacefully acknowledge the injustice and pray for the souls of the dead and the ancestors. And I didn't really know this, when I came into convert Buddhism. And it feels, and I feel bad, and I didn't know about the long-term roots that Asian Americans have put down in the USA in terms of Buddhism. And I feel that that's really was a disservice.
Yeah, I didn't know about it either. I wasn't raised Buddhist in this country. And I think even recently at book events, even when I talk to, high school students or college students, many reflect on, especially those who are, for example, Japanese American or often mixed race or mixed ethnicity, but grew up in the Jodo Shinshu tradition, which has been in this country since the 19th century. They talk about how they don't see their own forms of Buddhism reflected in curricula, what little they get, and not reflected in the popular media. And I do think, as you say, it's a disservice. It kind of something that we've been wanting to talk about. It's like all of these themes braid together. It's hard to like pick just one, right? But this issue of erasure and people can go to a place like Spirit Rock, which some people on this call might be familiar with, since it's not far from us, and think that that's the entirety of American Buddhism rather than just one little strand of it. And how, and sometimes in those places, I've heard things that kind of proclaim maybe that American Buddhism began in the 60s and 70s, which is missing, easily a century of history, right? Jane Iwamura calls this Asian religions without Asians. And, I also think about how this kind of two Buddhisms binary, where you have white converts on the one hand and Asian immigrants on the other hand, completely erases Black Buddhists and, Latinx Buddhists and indigenous Native Buddhists. And I'm so glad that there's volumes like Afrikan Wisdom and Black and Buddhist and many phenomenal Black Buddhist writers who've been so inspiring to me and my book. And I guess I wondered if you would be willing to talk about some of the parallels you see in terms of the erasure of Asian American Buddhists, and also we could say Black Buddhists, or maybe we should say like African diasporic people who maybe identify as Buddhist, if maybe they weave together, different traditions.
I think, one of the things, I can't remember where the article was, but they pointed to, it may be a presentation that Larry Yang gave, but it may not be, so I don't want to misattribute. But they talked about, an image, I think in Time or Newsweek, and the photo, it was about Buddhism in America, and it's a young Euro-American woman sitting cross-legged. And 20 years later, there's another article on Buddhism and the same image, thin, white woman practicing meditation, as if that's the only thing that Buddhists do. And it was my Asian friends, when I began to teach at East Bay Meditation Center, who told me, no, Arisika, most Buddhists in the world don't meditate. Most people don't know that the majority of practicing Buddhists in the USA are Asian or Asian American, that they just don't know that. Yeah. One of the parallels that I feel, and it comes more from my activist side, is that Asian Americans are often made to feel that they're foreigners in their own country. I've read so many stories where people say, oh, where are you from? And the person says, I'm from Kansas, or I'm from, wherever. No, but where are you really from? As if there's some other, other story. And it's all based on this foundation that the only people who really are American are Euro-Americans. And certainly we saw a lot of this in the Trump presidency. And I think that for me, there's a parallel between that people of Asian descent are seen as perpetual foreigners, and the way that for African Americans, we're seen as these people who can't be digested in America. So we can't be digested or assimilated into the body politic, into the fabric of society. I said once that every step that we take that brings us closer to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we are suspect. So if we're napping in a public area in our own dorm, if we're opening the key to our own condominium, if we're having trouble getting into our own house, if we are jogging in a public area, they have to call the cops on us, because clearly we don't belong. I think of Trayvon Martin. I think of, so there are so many so-called custodians, and sometimes they are custodians with guns, who somehow believe that if it's their territory, it is not for people who look like me. And we certainly know, or some of the people on the call might not know, the reason we live in segregated neighborhoods is not because people just wanted to live with their own people. It's because there were so many housing covenants so that you couldn't live in certain areas, you couldn't go to school. And some of the parallels between between oppression, anti-Asian oppression, and anti-Black oppression are so similar. People had to sue in San Francisco to get Chinese American children to go to public school with Euro American children. I mean, and the death of Vincent Chin, which galvanized the Asian American movement, he's an auto worker who's beaten to death. He's not even Japanese because of two white workers who feel Asians are taking our jobs because these fuel efficient cars were coming on the market. The judge said, oh, we don't arrest, you don't sentence for the crime, you sentence for the person. These two men pleaded guilty, they beat him to death, and they were sentenced to 3 years probation and $3,000. And that so parallels the way that Black people in the South were treated. If you went to complain about a white person, it was you who was going to jail. It's just, you couldn't get a fair hearing. So I feel there's a lot of times that our communities get pitted against each other.
Yeah.
And what I like to think is that all of us have unlearning oppression to do, whether we're in a Sangha, whether in a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, there's anti-Black racism, there's xenophobia. There are people who believe that everybody should speak English. I mean, so all of those things come up. But I like to think, and because I knew the activist Yuri Kochiyama, that our stories of reaching across lines and helping each other are so much more profound. Mm-hmm. And I think Buddhism taught, in its sense of interdependence, in its sense of loving kindness and compassion, these are the ethical values we really need for these times.
That's just so beautifully put. Yeah. There's so much I want to respond to there. I mean, I'm just thinking of what's undigestible, unassimilable, like you said, and how so many Asian Americans feel that way, or even the very foods we eat are seen as, disgusting, and how so many people have a story like that. And I think, part of the impetus also for writing this book was just wondering, like, where was something that would start to digest our stories and give us a feast of them, right? And I think Afrikan Wisdom, in the introduction, Jan Willis so beautifully talks about, it's a feast for all of us. It's a feast for our senses, something to savor. And so, it's fun to think about. I really can't wait for the book to come out and have them be maybe more in conversation together. And then I was also thinking, just circling back earlier, you were talking about pilgrimage, and you've talked about, you've actually been to Tule Lake at one of the Japanese internment camps, and you've done dance there. And I suppose I would love to hear you talk more about, right, you came of age during the civil rights era. You've been involved in activism longer than I've been alive. You're the godmother of Yuri Kochiyama's granddaughter. And I loved in the November 2019 special issue of The Arrow, your article, Reflections on Embodiment, Culture, and Social Justice Work in Selected Buddhist Traditions. And you talk about being other-mothered, I love that term, other-mothered, by Asian American women, Jewish American, Euro-American women. So I guess I'm really curious to hear you speak about, the kinds of cross-racial solidarities you think can be uniquely forged in our times, and also how we can learn about previous generations, and perhaps with a specifically Buddhist lens, or including, more diverse, Buddhist, earth-based, other spiritualities. But if you can reflect on that, that would be, so welcome.
I want to reflect. Tule Lake was one of the internment camps for the Japanese, and it is a particular camp, and it was called a segregation camp. there were these three questions that were asked of the Japanese about 6 months after internment. One, would you forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? Would you fight in the army? And I think there was a third, which I'm blanking on. And some people thought it was a trick question, like a mother of six is supposed to say that she's going to fight, and other people said, I was born here. I have no allegiance to, they thought it was a trick question. And some people just thought, I will fight for the US, but you don't lock me and my family up. Let us out. We're American citizens, and so to go to Tule Lake, and there were the lighting of incense. There was the prayers for the ancestors. There were people who died there who were shot. I didn't know that in the internment camps, people were shot, and not because they were trying to escape, or anything like that. But in the work I did, I came across, I worked with this dance group, Purple Moon Dance Project. And we had a grant to tell stories of the return of Japanese and to go to historic Japan towns. And so there were so many stories of solidarity. There was a white farmer, the Issei, the first generation, couldn't own land. And so this white farmer took money from the first generation, bought land, and then gave it to the children, the second generation, the Nisai. And then there was a couple in Salinas where I think maybe the woman had married a Filipino man, so the name was different. And so she didn't get called to go to camp, but they hid her grandmother for 4 years.
Wow.
And that would have been treason, during the war. So I think about, for me, Buddhism connects us to our still breathing center. It connects us to that indwelling spirit, our Buddha nature, it's sometimes called. And I think in the traditions, the Jodo Shinsho, the heritage tradition, it really is about how do we become a better person? How do we follow these precepts in ordinary life? It's not so much about what you do on the cushion and retreating from the world, although that's certainly respected, but it's about what do you do in the here and now? How do you extend the hand of friendship? And so one of the things I've seen is the way that Asian Americans were some of the first groups when the detention was happening of refugees at the border. Buddhists, Japanese American and Buddhist Americans were some of the first people to say, you cannot do this. They knew what it was like to live in these camps. And I want to ask you, because I want to hear more from you and about your book. It's easy for me to talk, but I want to, what did you find as you were talking, to younger people, and who also had stories from their elders about how this tradition had been held and whether it was secret and the struggle. I know that Reverend Ivamora talks about it. And I think Aaron, to some extent, having read his work, talks about that.
Yeah, as you know, I divide the book into actually 4 different sections because I interviewed 89 people and it was so complex to put them all together. It'd be extraordinary actually to see a book that really focused really specifically on activism, which wasn't my particular focus. It was because I hadn't yet seen a book that talked about Asian American Buddhists just as a pan-ethnic and pan-sectarian, multiple lineage group. I started with such basic questions. I remember even just like, what is your name and what does your name mean? Tell me the story of Buddhism in your life, your Buddhist journey. And then, of course, people talked about family and there was that intergenerational connection, right? And I think also, of course, tension. So in the first part of the book where I'm talking about what I call trailblazers, these Japanese American Shin Buddhists often, now Yonsei, Gosei, 4th generation, 5th generation. And I think some themes that often came up a lot was especially like exactly what you were just talking about, kind of how Buddhism is a universal religion. It serves as a common ground. It doesn't discriminate based on, anything, skin color, anything. And yet it's a tradition, I think, that has done such a good job of being culturally engaged and really engaged with the different cultures it's gone through. So I think for people, for example, in the Buddhist churches of America, as their very communities diversify through intermarriage, as, Japanese language attrition naturally happens over the generations, they're thinking, how do we make this universal inviting to people of all different backgrounds? But then also, how do we still honor our ancestors and the Japanese American roots and the kinds of resilience and strength that came about, from the past? And I would argue, because I think the youth I see, the Gen Z young adults, I think they're doing incredible work. But of course, they're always like very humble and very self-deprecating. But I see them as, there are trailblazers too. There are future ancestors that we will look up to. So there's this group, I think, that, just felt completely apropos to begin with those voices. And then in part 2 of my book, which I call Bridge Buddhas, I talk about the second generation Buddhists. So people whose parents immigrated as, part of the wave of post-1965 Asian immigrants. And it's striking to me that for the children of, these parents who were raised Buddhist in America, how challenging it is, because usually for their parents were, we could say, often an ethnic majority in the country, a racial majority, right? I mean, everyone looks Asian for the most part in the countries they came from. And often they were also a religious majority, if you're from Thailand or Cambodia or Laos, for example, or even a place like Taiwan, there are so many Buddhists. And so it's very different to grow up as a racial and religious minority. And so navigating those tensions intergenerationally, but then also with the broader society, when sort of coming out as Buddhist, one could be, be bullied or discriminated against, right? Or being seen as a superstitious immigrant. So just watching them navigate that. And yet I was thinking, well, if you talk to me, like, you were probably still Buddhist or you care about Buddhism. And so it was extraordinary to me, the ways in which second generation Asian American Buddhists are trying to understand how to, in some ways, reappropriate and reclaim Buddhism. But again, not in a way that kind of says, oh, Asian Buddhists are superior or something, but really in a way that can, again, honor their parents, honor their grandparents, understand that the Buddhism they're receiving now is more English reflected and maybe has different concerns of racial justice, social justice, environmental justice, these concerns that are so pressing to us during this time. So yeah, and then I should talk about part 3, which is integrators, which I would place myself in that part of the book. So I call these like first gen Buddhists, as in they're the first generation in their family to be Buddhist in America. So I was raised atheist and came to Buddhism, through a very circuitous and winding path. And for many of us, I think we might often come to Buddhism through a majority white convert tradition or through mindfulness, the secular mindfulness. And of course, many people find refuge there and find deep meaning in those teachings. But I think there's also this question that arises when we see the erasure of the Asian roots or the history, or we want to know, how can we live this Buddhism in a more culturally engaged way? And that was kind of the question I was answering in part 4 of the book, Refuge Makers, which is really, I think, I really loved writing that part of the book, because this whole book really is about Asian American Buddhism, but it's about kind of the slipperiness of this category and almost the playfulness of it, because you can't like reify it into a fixed thing, right? Like, we're like, what is this category? I don't know, right? And I wonder if, Black Buddhist as a category sometimes feels the same way, because there are so many perspectives on what it could mean to be a Black Buddhist. I mean, there's 33 contributions, I think, to Afrikan Wisdom, right? I love that. I love that so much, right? This kind of, you call it, I think, braided identities, which I love so much. Hybrid identities, braided identities. There's just a braiding together. So the reason I love part 4 of the book, Refuge Makers, is I feel it just gets to braid the voices of the previous 3 parts together. But also, people read this book and they're like, wow, there's actually a lot of Christianity in this book. And there's a lot of other people of color Buddhists, and there's white Buddhists, and there's allies. I'm like, exactly. Like, we look at Asian American Buddhists and it's a lens, but it's a lens for helping us to understand actually the incredible diversity and the interconnectedness of all of us, regardless of our racial background here in American Buddhism.
As you say that, as you talk about the integrationists, as you talk about that segment, one of the things I think about, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, I had read an article recently, I think by Christine Moon, and she talked about practicing as a Buddhist in either a Hawaiian temple or church, a Buddhist temple or church. I don't remember which it was, but she talked about the difference of Buddhism in Hawaii, which is a majority Asian state, where Buddhism is the second largest religion. And she talked about, and she had some advice for, people coming. If you see an elder doing something, you sweeping, you take the broom from them and you let them sit down. She talked about a sense of reciprocity of people who come and who bring food because they understand that there's food needed, that people come and work for hours, won't take any pay or any remuneration for making the temple grounds beautiful. And I really thought Alice Walker has an essay where she talks about the labor that her mother did in the church that they went to, where it was just understood that, that she would take a whole day and, wash down the walls and, refabric, some of the altar stuff. And that it was that in reciprocity toward the spiritual teachings that are being given you, you offer service, you clean, you make beautiful, you care for. And I felt that there was such a relationship, between that. I mean, what Moon is describing is an attitude toward the sacred. No, you don't just pay money and show up, which is so much the attitude that has come. I know that people get a lot out of silent retreats. And I know that this was a way to bring some of what had been learned in Asia to the American public, but there are also other ways. And so that feels so important. And I remember they're not there anymore, but a gas station that I used to go to, and in the kiosk, you pump your gas and then you go to pay the guy, and there's a little, mini store, and tucked away was a little altar, was a little statue of the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt such kinship, when I saw that, the way that, of course, you ask the spiritual forces in your life for prosperity, for a good life. Of course we do that. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
Life is hard.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I love that example. And I think also, dana, generosity, as a foundation of the Buddhist path, and how it's embodied in this very almost matter-of-fact way. I think of that as being a very powerful lesson when I've spent time in Southeast Asia, and also spent time, before I started this book, I actually thought like, oh, maybe there just aren't a lot of Asian American Buddhists, particularly young adults. And then of course, I was like, oh, maybe like 5 people will speak to me. And suddenly all these people came out. It's like, oh my gosh, we're actually everywhere if you know where to look, right? Like some of my favorite restaurants in San Francisco, or the favorite Tibetan restaurants, right? Like I look and it's like, oh, here's for example, Chaya in Berkeley, we love to eat there. And I believe it's run by a Mongolian Buddhist family, because you can see the little Buddhist icons in the space. And when I go there, I feel not only kinship, but just such a gratitude for the beauty, knowing that, we won't see them doing this when we're eating there, but I know they care for that altar. And there's a sense of, I think, protection. Like I feel actually very protected and safe and embraced in those spaces. And there's just like an extra element of care, knowing that there's something, a strand of what we might call the spiritual is present. And that kind of, exactly as you say, it's sort of like the reciprocity and relationality, even for something so small as a small statue, to still offer it a small cup, to still offer it a few grains of rice. And there's something about that really embodies the Buddhist teachings. And it's like you said, like, do we call that meditation or not? I mean, I think it's, to me, always been so sad to have Buddhism only be reduced to a single form of seated meditation, or for that to be the end all be all, because I think that our sufferings are wide and varied. Our joys are also wide and varied, and we're missing out in so many ways, both to alleviate suffering and to just experience joy together, when we don't look at the full spectrum of these Buddhist practices.
And I know we're going to have to probably go to Q&A, but I want to ask you, is there any, as you travel with an Asian, as you studied, what hasn't been translated? We have a lot that's been translated. It's mostly for the monks. The Buddhist teachings to lay people aren't always there. What do you see that hasn't been translated?
There's so much. I love this question so much because I think it makes us question even translation. Like, is it enlightenment or is it an awakening? Like, there's a different valence. How do we translate dukkha, right? Suffering or dissatisfactoriness. I love when we can get multiple translations from people of different perspectives, even on these key terms of Buddhism. But not that, like, there are so many vernacular and local literatures throughout Asia, for example, that haven't been translated. And I'm very fortunate, to be married to someone who's a scholar of Southeast Asian Buddhism, who's just nerding out all day, translating texts from Cambodia and Thailand and Laos. And we'll look at some of these texts and they'll be talking about local deities, and they'll be talking about these wild stories of a fish, a mother becoming a fish, becoming a tree, all of these things. But what it does is it like expands the creative possibilities of Buddhism to me, like to us. And I think in particular, I can say one strand that feels very striking is there is a lot on our debt to our parents, actually, debt and gratitude to parents. So I think these are texts that really take seriously, as much Buddhism does, karma, rebirth, but also, yeah, what do we owe our parents? I think that's actually a very deep question that I don't always see being asked in, again, the kind of more predominantly white convert communities. So in other words, there's something very intergenerational or also multiple lifetimes about it. And there's something about that very question decenters ourselves, right? It's not like, what do they owe me? Or like, why did my parents birth me into such a this and that, right? But like, I remember learning at one point this idea, there's one Buddhist text that talks about people choose their parents. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, I haven't always had an easy relationship with my parents, but I can't just blame them for everything, right? It suddenly made that relationship so much more relational, and to think about what are the implications of that and what are we here for? We're not here, maybe we're not just here just for ourselves, but there's something bigger than us. And I think if we could see more of these translations of these different texts, we would really start to get an understanding of the plurality of Buddhisms that are here.
That's so real. I mean, I always talk now, as I was a professor, of feminisms, plural, because how that's elaborated and what it means on the ground. And that's why I think your book is so valuable, because you really did cover that spectrum, that broad spectrum. And as you say, enlightenment, awakening. And I've actually heard a term once, return to the darkness. And given the English language, which is not a spiritual language, so it can be really difficult to translate. I heard a Native American woman talking once, and she said, in the traditional way, you could not use the possessive for any living thing. She was relearning the language, and she was very proudly telling her teacher in the original, oh, my daughter, she found this bug and it was her bug. And the older person said, you cannot use that term. So we lose in translation. So I see now that there's been an announcement that says that questions can go into the chat. I don't see anything yet.
Well, I would love to respond to what you were just said too. I think about there's this word in the Heart Sutra that's sometimes translated as practice. And when I think about the Chinese character, I remember sitting in a class at UC Berkeley, and they spent maybe 3 hours just discussing like one sentence. And that's the kind of care that gets taken in giving us translations of Buddhist texts. And often these translations are done not as an individual, right, but in community. Like there is something strange for me even to have my name on the cover of this book, because it was such a co-created thing. I think about how many Buddhist texts that people like efface themselves. They're like, well, if there are errors, I did that. But really, this was transmitted to me by my teachers and their teachers and their teachers. So anyway, going back to this Heart Sutra, there's one word that's often translated as practice, but the word in Chinese, xing, is like it's really, there has many, many meanings, but it could also be translated as sort of like walking or coursing through, or when I look at that word, I think about like moving through. So in other words, we sometimes practice the Dharma. I think about sometimes the limitation of that particular word, because I know in the Jodoshin community, for example, it's really not about practice. It's about actually a deep gratitude practice, and that reciting the Nembutsu. There's something of too much like self-effort within this idea of practice, or like sometimes I think there can be a sense of like practice. Okay, I'm going to do these things, put in my time, and I'm going to like get this result. But that may not be it. And there's something I love about thinking about different translations. What if it was like dancing or coursing or moving? We move through the world and there are all of these different kinds of vehicles. And to me, like that really opened. I remember sitting there and being like, wow, like the Buddhist texts we get, we owe a debt to the people who really selflessly poured their lives into something that was not going to make them any money, but thinking about, yeah, just the terms that sometimes we get so used to. And then when we get alternatives, I love those moments where we suddenly pause and think, huh, what does that mean? Like, what are the implications of that for my Buddhist journey or for my spiritual journey?
I think what you're pointing to is, the Buddhist teachings were originally oral. Oh, okay, there's a question. What are other translations of Buddha nature?
Oh, that's a really good question. Have you heard of others, Arisika?
I have not. You know, and again, what I do know about is when I go to translated sources and I read discussions, there are so many different ways. So
in so many different languages, right? Because I think even the Buddha part, we could think about it as awakened nature, right? Because here in that very word, like Buddha isn't actually translated. So then again, do we translate it as an awakened nature, an enlightened nature? And then even when we think about, like innateness, I mean, there's so much, you're right. Like, I'm sure scholarly careers have been built on just the very concept of Buddha nature. And that very concept, of course, like changes and has changed throughout history and time. And yes, Tathagata Garbha, thank you, Trent, womb of the Buddhas, which is so fitting for your word as a midwife, actually. Thanks for that reminder.
No, thank you, because it was very painful for me when I saw some of the misogyny that's in some of the texts. And as someone said, you need to think about the context and the times. And the monks are writing to celibate male monks. So the womb, the great, the mother of all Buddhas is a term that I've heard. The void out of which all arises. Thank you, Trent. And that again connects us to the feminine.
Yeah, that's, I think, another answer to your question of what translations and just stories do I want to hear more of? Just stories of women and the stories we don't hear of mothers and daughters and aunts. And there are so many of those stories actually in the Buddhist literature as well, but they're just not as highlighted.
Right. Although the lucky thing is that the nuns left some of their poetry and,
yes.
And that their delight. I think for many women in times where it was very patriarchal and women were supposed to be in the home under the domination, I'm putting that in quotes, of the brother, the husband, the father, that the freedom that people are talking about is and the freedom to study. I mean, so many all across the world for hundreds of years, it has been prohibited for women to read. And so you feel that in the delight of some of these nuns as they write about their freedom in the monastery, that they're not bound to endless cycles, of householder work. And householder work is to be respected. I am a mother, I'm a grandmother, a single parent for a while, and there's more. And for the mind and heart, for the heart mind that wants more, it must have been such a liberation.
Yes. Yeah.
That reminds me, I'm just going to say this. One of the things that was troubling for me as a person of African American descent is so much talk in sanghas about liberation. That's another term that's used a lot. And that it was so rarely connected. It's, as an African American who is an American untouchable, according to Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste, there was no connection to the here and now struggle of African Americans. It's one of the things I think that African American or African diasporic Buddhists are looking at.
Yeah.
Buddhism has to connect to our struggles.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, I think to the land, right? We were talking about this earlier today. I mean, just think about how Buddhism throughout history has always been connected to the local and the the local deities, the indigenous land. And so I see that's something I would love to see more of going forward. And I think it's starting to happen, but really in a deep way, kind of how do we honor the ancestors of the land that we occupy? And right, I love what you said about liberation as well, because I'm thinking, because I wasn't raised Buddhist, I think I've always associated that term with the Black community, with the African American community. I remember reading Alice Walker, probably in elementary school. I was so taken by it. And I think it was, maybe I was in 5th grade. I don't remember. I was so taken. I tried to write her a letter, which probably went to some random Alice Walker and was promptly returned. But I think about it was the way that she really wove together, I think, as you write in one of your pieces, the spiritual and the cultural and the political. And the echoes of that, I think, just it felt kind of like home, and it felt like it made so much sense that those things didn't need to be divorced. But again, braided together is, yeah, how it is and how it should be.
Well, I think about the Buddha calling on the earth to witness, and that
Yes.
really speaks to Buddhism being deeply grounded in indigenous beliefs and indigenous philosophy. I was reading something recently that looked at what's being said in the text about women by the monks and what's in the sculpture and the iconography, and how there's this period of time when, the female body may be suspect or temptation or something, but at the same time, these lush Indian figures that connect women to the land and the fertility of the land and auspiciousness. I mean, the luck, blessing, all
Right.
of that, and that both are happening. And so this particular author, Serenity Young, is saying, let's look at them in tandem. Let's not just say that the text is everything. Let's look at what is the iconography.
Right. Absolutely.
Existing at the same time.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, go ahead. No, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm just so grateful you talk about the iconography, the art, the architecture, because that's also such an important part. I mean, those are the spaces, the sacred spaces. And I'm thinking about how, to me, like the Buddhist and the Buddha's enlightenment is completely, it's not possible without women, really. I mean, it's not possible without Sujata giving him the rice milk. And I think about, they talk about him defeating Mara's armies. But when I go to, for example, just this past weekend, my husband and I were at a Khmer Kram temple in San Jose, so a temple of Cambodians who actually live in Vietnam. So not a lot of people know about this community. I didn't myself, but there are, Cambodian Buddhists who live in Vietnam who've come to the US. And as soon as we got there, there's right by the entrance, there's this beautiful, it's actually like a cave. There's like a hermit meditating in the cave. And then right next to him was this sculpture of the earth goddess, and she's always depicted with like her hair long, and she's wringing it out because it's the water from her hair that like flushed away, Mara's army. So I love that, right? The earth, the women, and that power. Like there's so much power and movement there, and yeah. So it's not just all male, but that's one lens people might like misinterpret, but it's much more.
And there is that. I wanted to say that there is, when one is in dialogue, when one can talk about the ideas, it's very different than when you write something. What you write is in print, it is there, forever. and you write something and then 20 years later you think, oh my God, I didn't have this information, or I didn't have that information, or I would have said it differently. So when Buddhism moved out of the oral traditions, something else also changed.
Absolutely.
In terms of,
Well, gosh, this hour has just flown by, but I just, I don't know if Erica is going to come back on and, brush us off. I know we've been given instructions to close at the top of the hour, but this has been just a pleasure and a delight. Thank you so much, Arisika.
Oh, thank you. I love being in dialogue, and I've loved your books. I'm looking at the galley prints, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything you need to say in closing, Erica?
Yes, thank you both so much for a beautiful conversation. This is actually something I've never even thought about, this intersection. So this was a beautiful learning experience for me as well. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight. You can get Be the Refuge by Chenxing Han, both in store and on our website. And you can pre-order Afrikan Wisdom on our website at greenapplebooks.com. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
wishing everyone a very beautiful week. May you be safe and protected from inner and outer harm.
All right.
And may
Be
you
well,
be peaceful
everyone.
and well. Be well.
Be well. Thank you. Blessings.
Bye.